What I'd like the GOP to do is realize that the 60-year period of libertarian dominance in the Republican Party ended with 2016. 2016 was itself a reversion to an earlier noble Republican Party of Eisenhower, TR, and Lincoln. Progressivism meant something different to Republicans back in the day. What it meant was we shouldn't let the Democratic Party or the left be the sole agent of change, because they'll get it wrong. And it meant mobility. Your kids will have it better than you would. That's the American dream. It was invented by Abraham Lincoln, so this is really a plea for a classic Republican Party, historically.
Frank Buckley is a foundation professor at the George Mason University Law School. He's taught there for over 30 years. He's also an author. His new book is Progressive Conservatism: How Republicans Will Become America's Natural Governing Party. Buckley's vision of progressive conservatism is based on three promises: economic and social mobility, a corruption-free country, and nationalism. Professor Buckley, great to see you.
Thank you for having me.
Professor, so progressive conservatism, are you contrasting that with a more libertarian style of conservatism where government plays a bigger role?
Well, I am, in fact. What I'm doing is I'm hearkening back to an earlier Republican Party, and I'm drawing comparisons with the Trump movement. But that earlier party, historically, is what the GOP was. It was the party of Lincoln, Teddy Roosevelt, and Dwight Eisenhower. And Ike said the Republican Party has to be progressive or it's nothing. Now, what happened after Ike was a turn to the right, and there was a correction in the Trump movement. So I'm trying to tie it all together, and I'm making a case for progressive conservatism as something noble, American, and something which everybody can get behind. So it may sound odd, but it makes sense to me.
Can you define progressivism for us?
Yeah, so let's start by getting some clarity about progressive. The word right now has been taken over by the left, but if you look at their issues, it's pitting one race against another, one ethnic group against another, shutting down free speech. There's nothing progressive about that. That's completely anti-modern. Progressivism meant something different to Republicans back in the day. What it meant was we shouldn't let the Democratic Party or the left be the sole agent of change, right? Because they'll get it wrong. So we're going to start by recognizing things need to be done by government, and we're going to come up with good answers. So that's what progressivism meant. It's a term that invites us to think of American history in a different way. As opposed to North versus South, think of American history in terms of West versus East. So West, and I'm from the West, West meant Republican virtue as opposed to a corrupt East, and it meant mobility. Everybody's going to be able to get ahead. Your kids will have it better than you would. That's the American dream. It was invented by Abraham Lincoln, so this is really a plea for a classic Republican Party, historically.
If you were to crystallize it for people, your vision of progressive conservatism today, if the Republicans were to tomorrow have a magic wand and have all the levers of power, what are the three first changes you would have them make?
Well, immigration's a big one. It was a big one in 2016. It remains a big one. Right now, I'm in favor of economic and social mobility, but we're importing immobility through our immigration laws. The change is one in which we should be admitting people, and I like immigrants, I'm one of them, we should be admitting people on the basis that they'll make regular Americans, American citizens, better off. There's no mystery about how to do it. It was pioneered in Canada, exported to Australia. It's something that Trump got behind, so reform of immigration laws would certainly be one of them. Corruption is an issue that the GOP gave away to the Dems, all right? And, you know, the GOP is not called the stupid party for no reason. How stupid is it to let Nancy Pelosi pass herself off as corruption-free? What we should be doing is taking a close look at regulating K Street, the lobbyists, which means shutting down some of their contributions to elected politicians, and also closing the revolving door between K Street and Congress. Right now, Congress is something of a farm team for K Street, and that opens the door to corruption. So that's certainly something we should be doing. I would also take a close look at regulatory reform, because if we're talking about mobility, that gets in the way of people working their way up. So a party that is in favor, as Lincoln was, of everybody having a shot at getting ahead would adopt those kinds of policies.
So if Republicans aren't pursuing these types of policies, what are they focused on today?
Well, they were focused on pure ideological free market policies. What that meant, for example, was they didn't have a problem so much with open borders, which brought in cheap labor for big business. Well, that's not a good thing for ordinary Americans. It's, by the way, particularly bad for African Americans. So, you know, that was one part of what it was all about. And they had a tin ear, you know, the party did, about corruption. They signed on to, again, a libertarian framework where you don't regulate campaign contributions. And I say, well, in general, that's true, but what about lobbyists? So we can do something about that. So you asked me about some narrow proposals. Well, there are a couple of them.
And this is why you call Trump a progressive conservative, because of his changes in immigration, at least.
Well, I have to say I was part of the Trump team. I was a speechwriter. I advised on policy. I think I persuaded the campaign to make mobility a big issue. You know, I persuaded the candidate as well. There was something to be said for some form of national health with respect to catastrophic medical insurance and the like. That most Americans would be behind that. And then I wrote about this afterwards in the Wall Street Journal. I had a map with 4 quadrants. And I said the sweet spot in American politics is conservative on social issues, but middle of the road or liberal on economic issues. That's where most Americans are. That's where the votes are. And before Trump, that message had been rejected by a right-wing Republican Party. So Trump was decidedly left of center, or certainly left of the GOP on those kinds of issues. That made him progressive and conservative as to social issues. So he was a progressive conservative candidate.
You feel in a post-Trump world, if we're in one, that the Republican Party should still keep the policies that he was advancing because they're popular with voters. You mentioned just now about left of center on economic issues. Do you feel that if something like inflation keeps up, you may see people go more to the right on economic issues?
Well, we're in emergency times right now because of inflation. And what that means is, you know, whatever your party, the one thing you want to do is cut back on government spending. So certainly wasteful government spending, and the Biden administration has been going around tossing, you know, billions here, billions there. That's got to stop fast. So there are no new initiatives to be taken on with respect to welfare policies, but I'm charting a path for the long term here. So immediately, let's get inflation whipped, and that's a matter of cutting back on spending.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned about the importance of social mobility in your work, and earlier in the interview as well, the importance of it to the American dream. What role has today's conservatism played in stymieing or restricting that?
Well, it hasn't done much one way or the other. It has, you know, it's done things that helped. The tax reform package in 2017 helped spark an economic revival, which ended up redounding to the benefit of the poorer of Americans. So that was wonderful stuff. No, I think what you want to do with respect to mobility is understand that the problem stems from not conservatives, but from the Democrats. So if you wanted a lot of mobility, what are the kinds of things you'd want? Well, you'd want to amend the immigration laws, which have the effect, by the way, of amounting to a massive wealth transfer from poor to rich Americans. You'd want better schools, and the party of better schools is the Republican Party, which promotes free choice. You'd also want to address the regulatory mess, the overburdensome regulatory state we're in, because that gets in the way of people moving up. So there's already a lot of overlap between Republicans and what I'm describing as a mobility agenda. Where I fault the Conservatives is in not going after the Dems and saying, look, you guys talk about mobility and equality, but you know what? You're the guys who caused the problem, and you're really just a bunch of stinking hypocrites.
Because in a recent interview, you had said that there aren't really any congressional lawmakers who are in the image of your ideal progressive conservative. Why is that?
I don't think they figured it out, but I think they will, because they're going to be nudged in that direction by the voters. So a candidate at the presidential level who wants to get ahead is going to be saying to himself, look, thank God Trump is gone, but there are all those Trump voters, the people he brought to the party, and what do I do to attract them? And I think what they'll be saying to themselves is the secret was that upper left quadrant, socially conservative, economically liberal. And that's where they'll be.
How about the conservatives who say that a lot of the problems we see at the moment, particularly economic problems like we touched upon, are caused by the government because the government is too big, and in fact we should be reducing the size of the government? How does that align with your progressive conservatism?
Well, it's true in many respects where the government we're doing that which it shouldn't be doing, but from Lincoln on, progressive conservatives thought there are actually things the state can do to promote mobility. Lincoln was not a complete right-winger in that sense. Lincoln was somebody who thought, with his Homestead Act, with his land-grant colleges, that there's a role for the state in making people mobile. So, yeah, let's be prudent and recognize there are those things the state can do.
Do you imagine the government reducing in size or expanding?
Well, I think initially it has to reduce in size relative to Joe Biden and the crazy spending that's been going on the last couple of years. Our big issue right now is inflation. Now, one thing about the kind of conservatism I'm describing is it's not theoretical, right? It's open-ended. It's looking at the problems from day to day, and it's addressing them. So there's not one single big idea. Rather, we look at what the events are of the day and we try to figure out how to tackle them. So that's the big issue right now. So no, the government's not going to expand at this point. It's going to shrink. But long term, there are things the government can do to promote that kind of mobility. Now, I mentioned one idea, if we can afford it, would be some form of catastrophic health insurance at a national level. And most Americans are behind that, right? So, we don't mind a $25 fee when we go to see the doctor, but what we don't like is the idea that you go into the hospital for something you didn't think was a big deal and you walk out bankrupt. Okay, we don't want that.
There are many people voted for Trump and maybe perhaps didn't vote for Trump who are deathly afraid of Marxist influences in America right now. You talked about critical race theory in your book. How do you communicate to these people that this type of change is different?
Well, what you have to do is talk about what progressivism means when the word is used by the left. So when used by the left to promote racial divisions or class divisions or threats to free speech, there's nothing progressive about that. When, however, you think that progressivism also refers to people like Eisenhower and Teddy Roosevelt and Lincoln, then you'll see there's another meaning where there is such a thing as real progress and not the false kind of progress promoted by the left.
In the book, you referenced how progressive conservatism could be seen by many as an alternative to socialism.
Well, exactly. I mean, we've avoided socialism up to now. Marx had a problem with that. In Marx's view, and he's writing in the 1850s, he's looking at America and he's saying, on my theory, America is the most advanced capitalist society, and yet it doesn't have a labor movement. It's not going to be ripe for socialism. How come? And he said the answer is mobility. people don't feel that they have to invest in socialism if they think they can get ahead and their kids can get ahead. The problem is what happens when we stop being mobile. When we stop being mobile, then socialism can look attractive to a lot of people unless progressive conservatives offer something better in terms of a real mobility agenda.
Are there other countries you look to as a reference?
There are other countries that beat the pants off us in terms of mobility. There are countries like Denmark in particular, and Canada, and getting there would amount to adopting things which are more progressive and also more conservative. So for example, in Denmark, they have a more progressive healthcare system. They also have a more conservative immigration system. So it'll be a little bit of both. So if you're just looking at promoting mobility, i.e. the American dream, there's a combination of things which are on both sides, progressive and conservative.
How difficult would it be to implement them given America's size?
Well, we are thankfully a federation, right, where decisions are made, important decisions are made at the state level, and nobody wants to touch that. That's been a great thing for America. But there are also things that can be done at the national level. So, and I've described one of them. I mean, there are a few things, campaign finance reform, some form of catastrophic medical. I also suggested some relief for overburdened students with their debt loads for their college tuition. So there are a variety of things you can do. And at the same time, you should remember that it's important to defend the conservative values, the social values of the country. Now, there's not much that any government can do to reform morals. I mean, any plan to reform the morals of a country is plainly imaginary. But yet there are things we can do to make it worse. And we've done some of them. So we have to look carefully at that.
Does it align with the founders' vision, do you feel? Oftentimes we hear criticisms towards, the likes of Roosevelt or Eisenhower that while they expanded the government, they didn't necessarily do it according to the Constitution, or it's debatable whether the federal government should be this size. But under your vision of progressive conservatism, how does that stack up?
Well, I don't have a vision which embraces a radical change to the Constitution or to the Supreme Court. I teach at a law school, and you get a lot of law review articles saying things like, all we have to do is amend this part of the Constitution. I think, well, that's great, but, rut's a ruck. It ain't going to happen, not in my lifetime. What Eisenhower did was he signaled that the Republican Party would make its peace with the New Deal. Okay, and up to that point, the GOP had not done that. And that made Eisenhower the most popular president in the 20th century, right? So, you're going to respond to what people want, and what people want is a role for the federal government. And we may not like it, but that's just the way it is. Think back to Katrina and New Orleans, and that was a problem really caused by the mayor and the governor, but the guy who took the heat was the president, George W. Bush. That's what Americans want. They want problems solved at the national level. That's just the way we are.
You talk about how the U.S. is moving more towards an aristocracy. You outline some interesting reasons in your book. Can you go through this with us?
Well, let me give you an anecdote. I moved here 30-odd years ago, and I was immediately struck at what a class society this is. Canada felt much more democratic, much more egalitarian. It didn't matter so much. You didn't have to worry so much about who was in front of you, who was ahead of you, who was behind, that sort of thing. No, there were institutions that reflected the fact that we'd become a class society. The idea of prestige universities, for example, as opposed to, old State U. That's profoundly aristocratic. And the way we've structured ourselves as a meritocracy, which is fine, it's produced an elite which has distanced itself from the truck drivers, from ordinary Americans. they don't care so much about it. That's why Trump was such a revelation in 2016 for the truck driver types and also for the elite. I think the elite realized they were threatened as never before. That's a large part of the negative reaction to Trump. Now, I hope Trump disappears. I don't want to see him again. But I think part of the attraction for Trump voters of Trump was he flipped the bird at the elite.
Who exactly are the elite in your eyes?
Well, they're the upper 10% of lawyers and lobbyists and academics and people who have distanced themselves from the concerns of ordinary people. If you're a member of the elite, there's no such thing as inflation, for example. You don't worry about it. It's not going to, you'll notice differences in price. You won't care, okay? You're removed from the concerns about ordinary Americans. You read about jobs disappearing from the Rust Belt, and that's about other people. It's not about you. Your job is secure. You're insulated from change. But there's a whole bunch of fragile Americans below the top 10%. They aren't insulated from change. They're the people who are dependent on the government getting it right. And they've been largely abandoned. They were told they were deplorables by Hillary Clinton, and they were told by Obama that the jobs aren't coming back. And so they said, right, okay, we see where you're coming from, and we're not going to be voting for you.
So what's your final word?
Well, I want the country to unite around a vision of what's good for America. I don't want us to be divided. The Democratic Party is the party that seeks to divide us and really displays a lot of hatred, I think, of ordinary Americans. So that's not going to wash. What's not going to wash either is a Republican Party that thinks it can simply snap back to a pre-Trump libertarian party. I think what I'd like the GOP to do is realize that the last 60 years, or the 60-year period of libertarian dominance in the Republican Party ended with 2016, and that 2016 was itself a reversion to an earlier noble Republican Party of Eisenhower, TR, and Lincoln.
Frank Buckley, great to see you. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you for having me.